Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well and welcome to my newest video. I want to welcome you to my newest video, which is going to be about many topics actually, but most primarily logic, language, science, reality, observation, deduction, and generally I'm going to be presenting a kind of what I see as the anti-realist or skeptical view of those things, right? Of our language, of our logical forms or structures of thought, of science, of reality, if we may say so, but not necessarily reality objectively, but our views of reality, our understandings of reality, our pictures or theories of reality. So generally, I want to argue that our access to reality is never pure and simple. It's never really completely unmediated and completely how would I put it, completely innocent, but it's always colored or formed or shaped by our particular perceptual, conceptual, linguistic, and other limitations and filters and faculties. So generally, that is the anti-realist position as I see it, as I defend it, on YouTube as well as on Facebook, Instagram, WordPress, Substack, and websites like that. So that is what I am actually exploring in much depth in recent times, in recent days, and that is also what I want to talk about in this video. So I hope you will enjoy this. What is to follow? So to begin with, I will read to you a quote from this article. The article's name is "Language Use in Nature: Foundation of the Philosophy of Science." Right. So the author is trying to discern how our understanding of how we use language gives us an understanding of our knowledge of nature, gives us the foundation of science generally, and how science functions. It is actually veridical and is actually a valid form of knowledge, a valid form of reasoning, uh, which is based pretty much on the basic logical structure of a language, right? Or the syntactical, perhaps, structure of a language. Now, the author says that a language is reducible to the logic. Language is reducible to its logical or syntactical structure, and I would actually disagree with that. I would say that semantics is much more colorful and much more varied, much more contextually dependent, and much more ambiguous, that can be actually reduced to a simple logical structure or formal structure. But nevertheless, okay, and I will read you the quote I picked out from this article. The article is by Muhammad, uh, I guess, Yusuf MD Aminu. That's the name. Now I'm probably not pronouncing it fully correctly, but you will excuse me. You will excuse me for doing that. I'll read you the quote. It is premature if we suppose that the limitation of our world is the limitation of our language. Right, where he pretty much quotes Wittgenstein, or paraphrases Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein. The reason is our language may be limited, but it is not truthfully reflecting our world. Sense perception is then like a static canvas, but with linguistic form of questions, we are able to analyze the static canvas and discover its intelligible significance. Now, I'm correcting the grammar of this because the English is far from perfect in this article. I'm trying to make it more intelligible. So he continues: the limits of analyses we can make is only limited to our creativity and willingness, right? Our use of language is necessarily means that our use of thought and reasoning. I'm not sure how that's supposed to work, but okay. grammatically. Therefore, sense perception, like the static canvas, can paint 1,000 words if we use our language correctly to analyze it. Language with logic beneath it, through its grammar, can help us to put the sensible data or images we perceived in logical manner, and further to analyze it by systematizing meanings connoted in the language itself. Language also can be reduced to logical proposition, so logical analyzation can be done more efficiently. Uh, so this is pretty much the statement, one of the statements in this article. It's supposed to be some kind of argument, but this kind of what I understand is a linguistic realist or conceptual realist or scientific realist a point of view or perspective or position. And now I will read you what I wrote here as my response, and perhaps comment on it briefly while I read it. So I would say our understanding of words differs between different speakers, as well as varies from one speaker at different times, right? But not only that, but even for a single speaker at a single time, the intended meaning of a word or the understanding of a word can never be gauged completely to an utter unequivocity, or unambiguousness. The understanding of a word and concept can perhaps be defined, but verbally defined and thus relatively specified, but there is but a finite number of extant words in one's vocabulary and an infinite number of possible different reference situations, so we must conclude that there is a miscongruence or perhaps an incommensurability between words and things, and never a complete correspondence. A complete correspondence between a sentence and a state of affairs would be a mere naming, and because the particular states of affairs are unique, it wouldn't be transferable to other situations and speakers. It would be mere naming. It would be mere naming and wouldn't be generally significant. So it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. I guess it wouldn't be extendable to different situations, different empirical states of affairs. Language is a shorthand, and this is my somewhat poetic ways to put these things. Language is a shorthand or a shortcut, a surrogate, and a stand-in mark to label and be able to remember and communicate without having the sensory presence constantly before one. Thus, the symbolic nature of language speaks against its literal representative accuracy, and what distinguishes a more prosaic language from a more pictorial one is the degree of abstraction from the mere immediate percept, and not the capturing of the exact logical structure of its subject matter, or what it talks about, what the language is about, what the linguistic expression is about. Now, the author here in some way quotes Wittgenstein and tries to disagree with Wittgenstein. And I would actually disagree with Wittgenstein too at this point, but we must know that this is the early Wittgenstein. This is the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, right? I think it was published in 1922, if I'm not mistaken. So this is the early Wittgenstein, and the later Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations probably already moved away from this kind of a more realistic or simplistic conception of language that he propounded in the Tractatus. But I too would say that the limits of our language are not necessarily the limits of our world, because we can perceive things, we can have some kind of contact with reality that is extra linguistic, and that is actually how we get outside of that kind of that kind of vicious circle, or some kind of haunted loop of language. How we get out of the labyrinth of language and actually have contact with actual linguistic reality. We can do that, I would say. I don't think that's even. I mean, perhaps it's controversial to people like the early Wittgenstein or Derrida, or people like that. Perhaps even Heidegger. But I wouldn't necessarily agree with how the author presents this idea, because the limits of our language are not necessarily the limits of our world, right? We would agree with that, but they are the limits of our understanding of the world. And our understanding of the world can never be abstracted away, or can never be removed completely from our language. And the limitations of our language are the limitations of our understanding of the world, which is uh, linguistic in nature. Uh, so I think it's kind of a. I think it's kind of a. I don't think it's actually valid to assume that our culturally contingent language is somehow able to accurately capture the objective structure, the ontological structure, the logical structure of the world itself, because the language has its own socio-historical context, it has its historical origin, and it has an explanation for its existence that is not merely reducible to our attempts to describe reality accurately and objectively. So there are other factors in play in the very origination of language and development of language that are not merely epistemic, that are not merely logical, that are perhaps social or political or prudential or economic or whatever else it may be, biological. Uh, and actually, I would say, as I actually said here in my note, the prosaic, our own type of language, the I guess the popular alphabetical type of language we have today, we think of it as somehow more privy or privy to to capture the objective structure of the world, right? Then these other languages we consider primitive or outdated or limited in some way that our language isn't. For example, English, one of the most popular languages, or other similar languages. Uh, right, we have this kind of elitistic or perhaps even colonizing mentality, and we have this kind of ethnocentric and ethnocentric and I don't know how to put it, but we think our language is our language, not just any language, but our language is kind of superior to many other languages and previous languages. And we take our language to be the paradigm or the representative of language as such, which is not really the case. And I would say even perhaps the differences that exist between our languages, perhaps, I don't know, Egyptian hieroglyphs or anything like that, right, are merely differences in degree and not really differences in kind, because the ambiguity, the inherent ambiguity in language can never really be gotten rid of, can never really be transcended by any kind of language that is supposed to be a tool for communication, thought, right, understanding and stuff like that, because it may be in the very nature of thought and understanding in language that it kind of falsifies or mystifies the actual linguistic reality, to subdue them or to subsume them under our own categories of understanding, which already stops being a completely objective description. As thought, there enter the subjective elements of our particular and contingent ways of understanding and speaking. Uh, yeah, that, as I said, that are explainable by other data and other factors, and not just merely some kind of pure correspondence or pure neutral or passive or completely objective description of reality as it is in itself. So the author in the article also explores the philosophy of science, right? Where he talks about how a better understanding of a language and logic inherent in it can bring us closer to a better understanding of the philosophy of science, or how science functions, how science is done or supposed to be done, right? So he gives an example. He says that you know, science isn't merely the description of the immediate facts of sense perception, right? And I would agree with that, actually. So science isn't merely some kind of neutral or passive description of the immediate percepts, or the immediate facts of sensory observation. But science also postulates, which is a key word actually there, because it's not really strict discovery. Science postulates some kind of hypothetical entities, or some kind of unobservable entities. They perhaps, at least at that moment, we cannot directly observe, but we postulate them, we hypothesize their existence for the purpose of explaining the facts that are directly observable. So those hypothetical entities wouldn't be directly observable, or states of affairs, or forces, or whatever, but they help us to explain what we can directly observe in our sense perception. So he gives an example, for example, of the ether, and the, not sure how outdated that conception is, but that's really debatable even within physics, I would say. But he gives an example of the ether, for example, or perhaps to take a less controversial example, he gives an example of gravity, right? So we cannot really directly observe the workings of gravity, the force of gravity. I mean, how can we even observe a force? What is that? What are its, you know empirical characteristics? What are its perceptual features or properties, right? But what we can observe are the supposed effects of that supposed gravitational force, right? So we observe, for example, we observe things falling, right? In the simplest possible example from everyday life, we observe things falling to the ground where we let go of them. We don't have any surface, hard surface to stand on. So they generally fall to the center of gravity, right? That is our generalization from any observations. Uh, but yeah, that is the given, right? That is the immediate empirical or sensory fact, so to speak. But we are not really satisfied with observing and describing our observations, but we also want to explain why that happens, right? Not just how it happens or that it happens, but why it happens, right? So we postulate, or we speculate, we hypothesize, we postulate this kind of gravitational force that is supposed to explain why objects fall to the ground generally when we drop them, or when they don't have any support beneath them. Um, right. So the gravitational force is a hypothetical entity, so to speak, because it's not directly observable. But he says science, that is also part of science, right? So science also tries to explain the observed fact by perhaps sometimes postulating some unobserved entities for that purpose, right? So I think that is all well and good, right? But the thing we need to understand is that is actually abduction. That is abduction. That is a form of reasoning that is called abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is pretty much reasoning to the best explanation. So we have some observed facts, and we want to explain them. So we postulate something that we cannot really directly observe, but that would, if true, explain the occurrence of empirical phenomena that we directly observe. So abduction, actually, the problem with abduction is that its conclusions are not certain, right? Its conclusions are merely hypothetical or problematic, or however we want to put it. They're not certain. They're merely, at best, probable, right? They may be given a high degree of probability, perhaps by our judgment or our reasoning, but they can never be They can never be completely established beyond all possible doubt. Uh, because simply something else may also come into their place. Something we cannot even think of at the moment may actually be the actual reason or the actual cause, if you may say, of that empirical phenomena that we cannot even think of, or that we don't even know exists, right? So that is just hypothetical. And as Popper said, for instance, and I agree with Popper on that point, right? So, you know, that kind of hypothesis, scientific hypothesis, because it is a hypothesis, it's not an established fact, you know. It is a hypothesis, perhaps theory, right? If it's more complex, right? But if it's more encompassing, more comprehensive, but it is hypothetical in that it cannot be verified directly by empirical observations. It can only be falsified by a possible other empirical observation, but where we draw we draw predictions from that, or we derive possible empirical statements that will follow if that were the case. And we see that they do not obtain, right? And so we can conclude then that the hypothesis is false, but we can never establish or verify that hypothesis beyond all possible doubt. We cannot verify it positively, right? We cannot establish its truth. We can only we can only say that it hasn't been proved false so far, right? It has withstood many empirical tests, and that's the best the scientific theories can do, according to Popper, right? It can never be verified beyond all reasonable doubt, but they can be, right, they can withstand empirical tests, and in that sense gain strength, right? They're not really contradictory with any known observation, any known or documented or available empirical observation or fact. So that is, even though science is not really reducible to the description of mere sense perceptions, the abductive aspect of science is problematic for that very reason that I mentioned, in that it cannot establish the truth of the hypothesis with certainty, but can only say that the empirical observation, or perhaps the results of experiments, are compatible with the hypothesis. So they not prove the hypothesis false, but they don't even they don't prove it true either, right? They don't prove that it's true either. So that is one problem with that kind of simplistic scientific understanding of science, where we think that science establishes these kinds of truths about unobservable entities with certainty or with complete precision. So in this article, in section 3, the author goes over a simple deductive syllogism or argument. Syllogisms are pretty much deductive forms of logical reasoning, deductive forms of logical argument. So he goes over a simple deductive argument, simple syllogism, which says that, so premise 1, that's the first assumption, first statement, says John is a chef, right? Premise 2 says a chef works in a kitchen, and the conclusion says John works in the kitchen. So from John is a chef and a chef works in the kitchen, we can conclude that John works in the kitchen, right? So that is supposed to be a kind of a logical exercise, which demonstrates that the logic of our language and thought reflects the logic of the world, or the ontology, or the ontological structure of the world, the real ontological structure of the world. And he says that we can observe that John works in the kitchen, and from that we can see that deductive syllogism is valid. So that it really follows that there really is a sort of logical structure to the world that reflects or that mirrors the logical structure of our thought and language. So that is a sort of a realist position. But I would say to that that what can we really observe, right? What can we really observe in the concrete empirical situation? We can observe that John works in the kitchen. Perhaps we know who John is. Okay, we can agree to that, right? We identify John. by some intersubjective standard. We know who the person is that the name names, and we observe, for example, that he works in the kitchen, right? We can observe that, but can we really observe that John is a chef? Distinctly from our observation that he works in the kitchen. What does it mean for someone to be a chef, right? What does the word chef mean, other than someone who works in the kitchen, right? So are there really two facts there? Are there really two facts? Is there a fact? Is there the fact that the John is a chef, and also the fact that John works in the kitchen? Or is it just really one fact actually in reality? And all we do is pretty much explicate the meaning of the word chef in this case, and see that the John's actual role, John's actual job satisfies the definition of the word chef. I don't think we actually have two facts there, right? We only have the fact that John works in the kitchen, and we have the meaning of the word chef. And that word applies in the given case, actually applies to what John does, right? So I would say that this kind of deductive argument, or generally deductive arguments, we may even say, are pretty much the in a certain sense, the conclusion is already contained in the two premises, right? It's already contained with the two premises conjoined, at least, right? Not just in the first premise alone, because chef could mean anything else. Chef could mean a great thing we sit on. I'm giving random examples. It doesn't really matter, but chef could mean anything. But in this case, it means someone who works in the kitchen, right? And that linguistic fact of the meaning of the word chef, and the fact that John works in the kitchen, means that John is a chef, right? But we can even perhaps we can even reverse this kind of reasoning. So the premise one could also be the conclusion. I hypothesize here. I'm actually rather sure that is the case, but I'm not completely sure. But I'll remain with that, right? So we have the fact, with the observable empirical fact, that John works in the kitchen. The person John works in the kitchen, and the chef means someone who works in the kitchen. So therefore, John is a chef, right? But that is not an additional fact. The conclusion isn't an additional fact that is logically or ontologically independent of the premises, right? It is just the explication of the premises taken in conjunction, taken together. It is just one thing that it implies, but I believe that now this is perhaps a bit more bold and wider implication or conclusion, but implication as such simply means if something implies something else, then that consequent, or that which is implied by the antecedent, or that which implies, the consequent is already contained in the antecedent, right? Or the what is implied is contained in what implies, right? So all we do is actually explicate the contents that are already tacitly present in the antecedent. We don't really get any new knowledge or new facts from that kind of deduction or from that kind of explication. So I would say right here that all deduction is pretty much an explication of some facts of the world. And I would venture to say also the facts of the world, together with the meaning of our terms, give us new sentences, but they don't really give us new facts. They give us new sentences, new linguistic forms, but the sentences themselves are, pretty much reformulations of each other, or rephrasings of each other. So we don't really get any new knowledge by deduction, as Descartes also already speculated about, right? Deduction just doesn't give us any new knowledge. Deduction just brings to light what is already present in the premises. So that's one thing I would say here. All right, that has been it for this video. I hope you have enjoyed the content I presented here. I hope it has been interesting, informative, illuminating, intriguing, and stuff like that. And I also urge you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Perhaps follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Substack, WordPress, wherever you can find my name, where I post regularly. As of late, especially on Facebook and Instagram, but here on YouTube as well, of course. But so yeah, if you wish, you can follow me there for more content like this. And also, if you feel so inclined, I would urge you to be more than free to try to donate, to try to support me in a financial type of way. If you want to support these kinds of projects and this kind of content, then I'll be, if that were the case, I'll be much more able to do this kind of work more consistently and more regularly, and perhaps even better and more seriously, if I had some kind of financial support or financial reward from doing this sort of thing. So I'll post a link to my PayPal in the description, so you can also support me that kind of way, as well as subscribing and following if you do not wish to donate at this time or any other time. So that will be it for this video, and I will see you in the next installment, as well as on other social media websites and blogs and whatnot. So goodbye for now, and have a great day.